Well, I would certainly have advised them not to only read reports such as the McKinsey report on what is likely to happen to short-term insurance in South Africa, which painted a picture really of doom and gloom, quite frankly, and the perception that the recessionary effect of the pandemic would last a lot longer. The point is just that within 2 quarters after that disastrous second quarter of last year, most of the key sectors of the South African economy had almost or more than fully recovered. And we were very fortunate. We were very fortunate with a magnificent agricultural season, harvesting season. We were very fortunate with the fact that we are in a new commodity super cycle, apparently, and our mining products have been doing exceptionally well. I like to believe that the same holds also for Namibia. In that regard, it certainly softened the blow. We had a record trade surplus, etc. And also to realize that, because of the fact that people are not driving their cars, there would be a significant decline in accident claims. And even though some of the insurance companies, and we're very grateful for that, obviously, did manage to also soften the blow with some premium adjustments, it was not remotely as bad as was foreseen initially. I mean, even the South African Reserve Bank, I find it quite ridiculous that they told banks not to pay dividends, because apart from the hospitality industry, and it's very sad, obviously, and of course industries that are specifically affected by the stricter lockdowns, like restaurants, like the liquor trade, etc. For the main sectors of the economy are more or less where they were prior to the pandemic. I would certainly advise them to be very careful, is maybe not the right word, but just to watch out for possible reputational damage, because if there are companies that are more accommodating towards business interruption claims that do have the reserves to actually get over this hurdle, they stand to gain tremendously in the eyes of their clients. Whereas those companies that are forever going to the courts to try to fend off, the payment of these claims, they could really suffer reputational damage. It's a highly competitive industry, especially in South Africa, to some extent also in Namibia. But of course, as we know, the Namibian population decrees actually that it is not as competitive as in South Africa. Yes, as far as the individual insurance company is concerned, I certainly am not in a position to comment on that. What I do know from my discussions with Ryan Woolley from Insurance Claims Africa, for whom I did the research, which is simply based on the macro indicators, is that there have been profound differences in the approach towards business interruption claims by different companies, including the 3 that you mentioned. As far as the record profit is concerned, unfortunately, the South African Reserve Bank decided from the first quarter of 2021 onwards to change the classification for the balance sheet items for short-term insurers without providing us with a decent historical data that gives you a longer-term perspective. I find this very irritating, to put it mildly, until December last year. And that's the data that my original report was based on. Unappropriate profits was listed as a separate balance sheet item. Now it's chunked into technical provisions, and it is the largest portion of that, but one is not sure what else is in technical provisions. Well, the detail of that is not known. If you look at my original report, what stands out here is that the global economic recovery and the domestic economic recovery was swifter and stronger than most people anticipated in April 2020, when the strict lockdown occurred. So a much swifter and a much stronger economic recovery occurred. In the meantime, people were driving a lot less. The property market in South Africa has started to recover quite magnificently, which means that to the extent that premium income is based on the resale value of a property, there is a bit of a bonus for short-term insurers. And if you look at the data in 2020, the key indicator of short-term insurance premiums received increased to a new record of more than 130 billion rand year on year. Unappropriate profits increased by more than 20% to a new record. And the total assets of the STI industry, short-term insurance, followed the record-breaking streak by increasing 12% to a new record of 220 billion rand. It is a very strong and financially resilient sector, as far as I'm concerned. That's what the data tells me. Their unappropriate profits at the end of 2020, according to the South African Reserve Bank, and they get the data from the short-term insurance themselves, and to the best of my knowledge, it's well audited, stood at a record of 53.5 billion rand with a B. Yes, I think they've got enough money to pay the business interruption claims. You see the unappropriate profits, which was a separate balance sheet item under liabilities, obviously, because I think anybody with accounting one background knows that unappropriate profits is a liability in a balance sheet. That figure, indirectly, yes, certainly. If, for instance, directors were paid huge bonuses, that would lower the profit in a particular year, and they don't even call it a profit, they call it a current income surplus, but it's the same thing as a profit. So indirectly it would be reflected in here, but if the unappropriate profit as a balance sheet item increases, it means that, this is money that has not been paid out in the form of dividends or expenses. I just want to latch on to the issue of bonuses, and you will find this interesting. In the first quarter, I'm now moving beyond my original report because I've got first quarter data now, even though they've changed some of the classifications. So in the first quarter of this year, 2021, the total operational expenses of the short-term or the non-life insurers in South Africa was 16.16 billion rand. Now, in the same quarter, a year ago, in 2021, prior to COVID, it was 8.6 billion. That is an increase of 86%. And those operational expenditures, the three major items in combination are management fees, commissions paid, and salaries. So bonuses would certainly be in there. Now, how can it be that an industry in 1 year can increase its operational expenditure by 86%? This is not claims paid. And the really frightening thing is that the total claims paid, excluding reinsurance, was 18.4 billion. Their operational expenses was 16 billion, which is not far off the mark. Getting back to whether what holds for South Africa holds for Namibia, yes, to a large extent, except that, of course, South Africa is a much larger market. We've got 60 million people in South Africa. We've got demographics on our side in terms of growth of markets, but obviously also more riots as we speak, unfortunately, and more unemployed people. But the fact is that if a particular insurance company wants to do business outside of South Africa in neighboring countries, and there were to be a natural disaster in one of those countries, certainly if it's part and parcel of the same company, they can use whatever reserves they have from whatever business they do in other geographical areas to make sure that they comply with their commitments in other jurisdictions. That should be standard practice. It does give you an idea of what the industry as a whole is capable of in terms of having sufficient reserves to pay the business interruption claims. They do. I mean, the point about the short-term insurance is not to just, get premium income, and then in a good year, if you don't have many claims, you make these huge profits. Next year, there's a hailstorm, there's a fire somewhere, there's some crisis, then you have to get rid of these reserves. I mean, that's the whole point. It's ebb and flow. It's a very risky business, and one has sympathy for the risks that they have to take. But when something like COVID hits you and business interruption hits you, and you have reserves of this magnitude, then, quite frankly, if you resort to the courts all the time and you refuse to pay claimants, even after having court orders against you or judgments going against you, this is not good publicity, quite frankly. There are two aspects here. Government behavior, as defined by the lockdown regulations, right, did determine people's behavior in the sense that they drove less mileage, and that drove down claims. But that same government behavior, the lockdown regulations, also forced many businesses to close their doors for a certain period of time. And that increased claims, the business interruption claims, obviously. So yeah, it's a bit of a balancing act here. And now it depends on an individual insurer, whether they get the bulk of their revenue from in motor insurance and property insurance claims, which used to be the two big ones. But now, obviously, in some cases, I suppose, I'm assuming that business interruption claims would also be a significant item. So government behavior, the lockdown, obviously had a positive and a negative effect on the insurance companies, and it's important to bear that in mind. But you cannot separate the lockdown from the virus. People were afraid of the virus. With or without lockdown, they would have driven less. And with or without lockdown, companies would have had serious problems with maintaining their turnovers. So this is something to bear in mind, and I think the courts also found that you cannot separate the lockdown from the prevalence of the virus.